Welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm Cheryl McKenzie. Today is the second last show of the season and we have a big topic to present. Today we're putting in focus Canada's celebration of its 150th birthday. What does it mean to you? We want you to join our conversation. Our phone lines are open. Call us toll free at 1-877-647-2786. You can tweet us at APTN InFocus. Use the hashtag Canada150InFocus or email infocus@aptn.ca. Before I introduce you to our guests, let's set the scene. For Indigenous people, is Canada's 150th birthday cause for celebration? Where outdated policies, land disputes, cultural appropriation debates is still a cause of us versus them. The last 150 years have included assimilation policies geared towards killing the Indian in the Indian. From residential schools, the 60 scoop, broken treaties, unfair funding for health and education, child welfare, dispossession of lands, and exploitation of natural resources. In a time where reconciliation is a buzzword, can Indigenous people really be seen as equals on their own land? Canada 150. Time to break out of the colonial narrative. Joining us now in studio is Kahanus Manuel, Secwepemc from Kamloops, British Columbia. Manuel is well known in her activism against corporate development projects in BC. She's also been involved in direct action movements against Sun Peak Ski Resort, Imperial Metals, and Mount Poly mine spill. She's the granddaughter of the late George Manuel and the daughter of the late Arthur Manuel, both who fought tirelessly for the rights of Indigenous peoples. She now has her sights on Resist 150. Kanahus, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. How does it feel being here?
Well, I spent the morning down here in Winnipeg in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's the camp to bring attention to it, and I heard a lot of the issues that we are all facing straight across Canada. One of the big words, and this is a buzzword in Indigenous country, is genocide. And we charge Canada with 150 years of genocide on our people. There's major violations that continue to happen by the hands of the Canadian government, the provincial governments, and the police and the military that represent for Canada. We were here to really address what 150 years means for Native people, and that includes child apprehension, that includes the Kinder Morgan pipeline, that includes the murdered and missing Indigenous women, the fentanyl crisis, and the homeless crisis. We had a young Secwepemc woman die this past year because she was homeless. These are the issues that we're addressing, and we're using this platform of Canada 150 to address these issues.
Yes, and I know your dad, the late Arthur Manuel, he was a guest on our show here many times. What did you gain from growing up with your grandfather George and your father Art?
Well, I was trained to be a organizer. I was trained to take on this fight, although my father had said he didn't want any of his children to have to sacrifice their whole lives to address our underlying issue, the land and title issue here in Canada. But I was forced to, because as a young woman, there's no other people standing up. You have to take that place, and you got to create a voice for our people and for our women.
What is the movement behind Unsettling Canada?
150 years of occupation on our soil creates a lot of these issues that are really in the face of the Canadian public right now. This inquiry into the murdered and missing Indigenous women, this is all linked to the occupation and displacement of us off of our traditional territory. This is the underlying issue that we need to all address, is that Native people across this country hold this radical title, and that means the complete ownership and control over our lands and resources, but yet it continues to be ignored here in Canada. Our treaty rights are continually being violated. In BC, we have not signed a treaty, and that's one of our big oppositions right now. And we are addressing that at the United Nations level, international level, where we're saying that the Indigenous people are the ones that hold this radical title in this country, and it needs to be respected, and it needs to be recognized and implemented. in Canada.
Mm-hmm. And you actually confronted Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett at the UN. Can you tell us about the sign you held up and her reaction?
Yeah, I held the sign. It said, "Canada lies, 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 lies," and that was in response to her speaking at the opening ceremonies of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This year the theme was 10 years of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which says we have a right to self-determination, which says that we have the right to give consent or not to these projects, the free, prior, informed consent, which she addressed there on her opening statement. And it was lies, because we see that Native people throughout this country are saying no to these pipeline projects, no to these mining projects, but they continue to go forth full force without any consideration of this free, prior, informed consent that they need to get from the Indigenous grassroots people on the ground. So I confronted her with my sign, and she didn't like it, and she was stumped on what to say. And me and my brother George Manuel were there, and Russ Diabo was also there with us. And really, she was shocked, because she's so used to Native people going up and shaking her hand as the Minister of Indian Affairs. But to us, we don't need to be looked after by anybody, and we need to take back control of our own destiny and our future as Indigenous people, and it doesn't include her ruling over the Indians.
All right, joining us now by phone is Métis artist Christi Belcourt. She's an acclaimed artist and a really outspoken person on Indigenous rights. Christi Belcourt, thanks so much for joining us on the phone today from the Sudbury region. What message do you want to send out about Canada's 150th birthday?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I absolutely agree with everything that's been said, like 100%. And I think the other day I was just listening to George Erasmus's, they called it his fiery speech at the 125 mark of Canada's supposed birthday, and and in that speech he said, if you don't solve the problems that we are outlining for you now, then the French English issues in this country will not be your problem. Because there's a growing population of Indigenous young people who will not have the patience to be negotiating with you the way that you have wanted to negotiate, which is basically stalling. And so, all of those things he spoke about, language, which we're seeing, everything has actually gotten worse since he made that speech 25 years ago, not better. And when I think about where I would like to see, people are starting to sort of think about and talk, philosophically about where do we want to go in the next 150. First of all, I don't think there's a we here. I think that Indigenous nations, we need to have a serious conversation with Canada about how we are going to separate, how we are going to have our own countries, our own governance, how we are going to have our land. Because when I think about the Métis Nation, we've been completely dispossessed from our land. Canada has outright stolen all of the land. And where is our self-determination? That was a great big buzzword about 20 years ago, was self-determination. That was all everybody was talking about. Well, that never manifested into anything. And now where is our right, our God-given right to govern ourselves as Indigenous nations in this country on our own lands, in our own ways, as we see fit? And so I think Canada needs to grapple with that and come to terms. If they want to bandy about the word reconciliation, which they've been doing back and forth all over the place, I think that the number one thing that they need to talk about is restoration of lands. And when we're in a position where we are back to being, have our languages at full health, have our peoples at full health, have our own independence and our own country, then maybe we can sit down with the state of Canada and begin to talk about having a relationship. They've proven time and time again that they are not willing to have a real relationship with us. All they're willing to do is have it their way. And I think it's time that we start to really think about alternatives to this country that is called Canada, and how we can begin to think about having what is rightfully ours.
Christi Belcourt, while I have you on the line, is there something you want to say in response to the debate around appropriation prize?
Oh God, I think there's been a lot of really incredible response being put out by our own people. I think this just once again goes to prove that, you know, with every generation. I remember my dad, Tony Belcourt. You know, he's been a Métis non-status Indian rights leader for 45 years, and I remember him coming home just frustrated all the time because there was always a new Minister of Indian Affairs, a new Minister of this, a new Minister of that, and he says it's like we have to educate these guys every single time there's a new one that comes in. So it seems to me that each generation, I wasn't expecting to have to take this on. I think my dad wouldn't have wanted this for his child either. You know, and I'm looking now to the next generations, my daughters, and wondering what are they going to have to fight. The racism doesn't seem to be decreasing; it seems to be increasing, and so it's disheartening to always have to address it like this. And I don't think that Canada is learning. I don't think that Canadians even believe that they're on stolen land. I think that the learning curve for them is too high, and I think we need to talk about having our own countries now. And I think we need to have our own territories, and maybe Canada doesn't need to be Canada as it is.
Very interesting thoughts. I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your time with us. Christi Belcourt, acclaimed artist, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to get back to our conversation around your father, Kanahus. The late Arthur Manuel was a fearless advocate, as we were saying, in the provincial, national, international level about land claims, human rights, economic rights for Indigenous peoples. He spoke on our program many times. Here's a clip from a previous edition of InFocus in December 2014 when we were at the Assembly of First Nations election, where Arthur sat in a panel discussion and he talked about National Chief Perry Bellegarde and what he'll need to do to lead the Assembly of First Nations.
I think we need to talk about our right of governance, our right to our territory, our right to govern ourselves from that international perspective and not from the domestic Department of Indian Affairs point of view. And I think we need to work towards having a strong constitutional conference based upon that basis of our right to self-determination, and quit just depending on the High Court, the Supreme Court, for making decisions in this regard, because they're in a contradiction because of their conflict of interest, because they were created from that colonial doctrines of discovery.
Yes.
Go Art.
Yeah, there's so many internal systems that work against Indigenous peoples, as we've seen more and more now. That was just a little bit of what Arthur, your father, could just just explain so succinctly about how stop crying on the shoulder of the man who stole your land is what he's telling other First Nations here in Canada. Are there any other thoughts that you want to share about the legacy of your father, Arthur Manuel, Kanahus?
Yes, I really enjoy that quote. Stop crying on the shoulder of the guy who stole your land. And I believe that all of us have to do that. And this includes, when we're talking about Indigenous people across the country, it includes the Indian Act, and it includes the Band Office and the local way that the Canadian government is still maintaining control over the Indians, control over the resources, the program and service dollars that are being stripped from our people and leaving our people in impoverishment. And then you have the mining companies that are coming in and the pipeline companies that are coming in and also destroying our land and leaving us even further impoverishment. And I think this is the way that the government is able to go in and somewhat co-opt the chief and councils to have them sign these deals with the pipelines. And one of the things that my father had said was that it's the Indigenous people, it's the grassroots people at the grassroots level that are the rightful title holders and are the proper decision makers. They're the ones that are the hunters, the berry pickers, the medicine harvesters, the basket makers. They're the ones that use the land, and they're the ones that are most impacted, and they're the ones that need to speak out against anything that's out there to destroy them. And right now, that's Canada. And they're bringing the investors in, they're bringing the pipeline companies in, and we need to address both these corporations and Canada and the provincial government and be able to stand up and say no. There's no process to say no. There's only a process for people to say yes right now. And I really enjoy and respect what Christi Belcourt had said, is that we need a new way, a new creative way for us to be able to be independent and be sovereign. And one of the things I heard from one of the women who do frontline work here in Winnipeg is that our children are our sovereignty. They inherit that sovereignty from the beginning, and we pass that on to them. And we're passing on them a very big job right now and a big responsibility if we don't take our turn right now and really make an impact and really change the way that this country looks at Indigenous people and really take back control of our land and our territories.
Yes, and there certainly is talk about how that relationship is going to change. The Government of Canada is certainly working on it. Last month, the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples met for the first time, tasked with a new study about what a new relationship with Indigenous peoples would look like. Joining them for the first session is a well-known historian. With the story, here's APTN's Annette Francis.
One of the first witnesses to present to the committee is John Milloy. It's a bit of a history lesson on how treaties were perceived by First Nations in the West.
We all got together, so too, Assiniboine, Cree, the Canadian government, and we decided to share the land, period. Not cut it up like a pie, that piece is yours, that piece is mine, and most of it belongs to us, but to share the land as they understood it. That has never been an issue which has been sorted in the West.
Milloy says true reconciliation would be a resolution to the land and resources. He says there's decades of wrongs that were done across the country, including residential schools and the child welfare system.
Can you tell us how to make up for all the mistakes that was done in the past?
Milloy says almost 2 decades of studies and recommendations have not been acted on. He suggests the senators have an opportunity to move things along.
There's no reason that you can't demand some action, right? There have been great promises, there has been great rhetoric, and there has been little action. I'm shocked by the fact that a government can sit by when a Human Rights Commission says you must spend this money, and the government shrugs its shoulders and says, well, we must, but we're not going to.
Milloy says education and more political involvement is a way forward for Indigenous peoples, because a few Indigenous votes can carry a lot of weight.
Joining us now by phone is John S. Milloy from Peterborough, Ontario. Mr. Milloy is also the author of the book, A National Crime, the Canadian Government and the Residential School System. We do have a picture of that from 1879 to 1986. The book is published by the University of Manitoba Press. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us by phone, Mr. Milloy. How would you describe the reaction that you got from the Senate committee to your presentation?
Well, the Senate committee is full of very dedicated, very intelligent people. And, you know, when I left after those 2 hours with my colleague from Regina, it was clear that they had a better sense of the deep historical roots of the persistent colonial system that just keeps galloping forward. That provided them with a feeling of frustration, to say the least, because you know the answers are many and difficult, as we've heard from Christi and Kanahus, that real change needs to be made, and we have said that and we have heard that since the Second World War. From the white paper forward, people have talked about real change, to the Royal Commission, to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's how to get the process begun. Someone said, I can't remember who, there is no process to say no. But in fact, that's all we have, is a process by which the Canadian government is free and often too willing to simply say no to policies, to levels of funding, and so forth, when it comes to Aboriginal interests. So that particular power imbalance is at the heart of the inability of First Nations people and their allies to move the system in a different direction. I often used to tell my students, okay, if you put the date 1919 on your calendar and you move forward to today, whatever that day was, 1982 or today as it is today, and you trace the progress of people who were also left out of Confederation. Because remember, Confederation in 1867 was a whole bunch of white guys in Parliament and their business friends who were going to create a successful economic nation and thus preserve us from the clutches of the United States. Now, that was all very well and good. But other people were left out. There were no women. There were no working class people. And there certainly were no Indigenous people involved in that process. And the struggle for all three of those groups since the early 20th century has to fight their way in. And they've done that. Look at our labor legislation, which has brought working class people to power. Look at the changes in the condition of women in Canada, beginning with the suffrage movement and working its way forward through, the bra burning of the 60s and so forth. Aboriginal people, Indigenous people in this country are still pretty much in 1919. They're still trapped in a system which guarantees their minority and guarantees their powerlessness. It may have been Christi who said, look, we've got the Indian Act, we've got band council government, we've got provincial organizations and national Indigenous organizations, and that's the trap. Good old Perry Belcourt, I have great respect for him, but when he goes to the Prime Minister's office, he holds out a begging bowl. Please, sir, give us stuff, right? As somebody said, crying on the shoulder of the people that stole your land from you, right? And he has, this Prime Minister and previous Prime Ministers have no fear of saying no. I mean, what are they going to lose? A riding here and there? That's it. You're not going to prevent them from becoming a majority government or wielding the power that they have because you're outside the political system in this country. You're trapped inside the AFN and band council government ruled by the Indian Act. So there's where you have to ask yourself the question, where do we get fundamental political change to force the system to be truly a nation-to-nation system rather than what we have, an abusive parent whose birthday we're supposed to celebrate at 150 years.
What would you say is the main obstacle for Canada if it wants a good relationship with Indigenous peoples?
To get serious about the importance of Indigenous issues as national issues of political importance, right? We always fall back from our earliest history forward. We always fall back on the importance of resource development for the betterment of the Canadian state. And so you can go from decade to decade, period to period. It used to be the West with its wonderful potential for grain production, et cetera, and so forth, and move into British Columbia. And every time that happens, the Canadian government runs up against a fact which it can't come to terms with, which is the fundamental right of Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, to control their lands. And it'll come to a head, and it's come to a head again for Trudeau, this time with the pipelines. And he can't get himself unstuck from that. Does he listen to the boys in Alberta, or does he say, I'm sorry, fellas, it's 150 years down the road. We've never had justice for Indigenous people in this country, and I'm sorry, but we're going to make it a priority. How do you get him to make that a priority is the question. And I don't think we're ready yet as an Indigenous and allied community to pull that trick off, to force the hand of the government to move in the direction that we need them to move. Talk about we need to separate from Canada is understandable. It's also going nowhere, right? Until I see the appearance of an Aboriginal army from one end of the country to the other. Any talk about forcing Canada into a relationship of that sort, where we need power is in Parliament. Where we need fresh faces is in Parliament. We need fresh Indigenous faces running for office, taking over political parties like the NDP, as some minority people are already beginning to do, and sitting there in Parliament, staring at the Prime Minister, saying we are an important group in this deliberative institution, and we're going to force the sorts of legislation that are good for these people.
All right, Mr. John Milloy, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you very much.
Time for a break, and then we'll talk more about Unsettling Canada, the counterbalance to Canada's 150th. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Like our APTN InFocus Facebook page, follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, or call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Thanks so much for staying with us. We're going to go to social media now to hear what some of you are saying about today's topic. As always, we asked you a question on social media. We asked, what does Canada have to celebrate on its 150th birthday? We have this comment from Deanna. Our existence. We have not exterminated each other up to this point. Let's keep this living alongside each other. Ray tells us, Canada 150th equals continued death of our lands and waters, hence all life. Smash the 150th. Waylon tells us about Canada, what we have to celebrate, killing our people. And Opichi says, celebrating on the 150th, Canada has to celebrate universal health care. And this is from Daniel. I want out of this relationship. I want nothing to do with Canada. Probably talking about along the lines of nationhood and a new Canada. And of course, we want you to keep joining our conversation. Let me tell you how. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Like our APTN InFocus Facebook page, follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, or call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Artist Kent Monkman spent the last 2 years creating paintings for his new exhibit, Shame and Prejudice, a story of resilience. It's a look at Canada's colonial history through the eyes of an Indigenous artist.
And that last 150 years really runs concurrently with the period of modernity. It also runs concurrently almost with the signing of the Western treaties, the beginning of the reserve system here in Canada, the beginning of the legacy of incarceration of Indigenous people, the beginning of the residential school system, on and on and on, the institutionalization of Indigenous people that continues to this day. So here was a moment in time to really focus on revisiting this very harsh period of history, and to bring to lens it through my own artistic vision.
Makes you wonder what Canada's forefathers would have had to say about artist Kent Monkman's work. It certainly tells a big story within the story. I'd like to thank you very much, Kent Monkman, for sharing your thoughts and your work with us for our InFocus show on Canada 150th. Joining us now by Skype from Chippewa, Quebec, is Russell Diabo, policy analyst and editor of the First Nations Strategic Bulletin. Thank you so much for joining us, Russ. What are your views on Canada's 150th birthday?
Well, I don't think that there's anything to celebrate. And I don't agree with John Milloy. I think we have many communities and many Indigenous peoples across Canada who aren't satisfied with the relationship with Canada, and we have a basis to organize to challenge this 150th anniversary. In fact, we're organizing Unsettling Canada 150 for July 1st.
Yeah, tell us about that call to action.
Well, it's following up on the work on Arthur Manuel, who wanted to make sure that Canada's birthday didn't go unchallenged. The fact that he always pointed out that we're on a 0.2% economy based on that's the size of the land base of reserves across Canada when you add them up. And the main thing we want to focus on is the right to self-determination as Indigenous peoples, and the rights to lands, territories, and resources. So this is what the focus will be. We're hoping to see actions across the country, including in Ottawa. And it's something that the Prime Minister, Justice Trudeau, hasn't mentioned, is lands. Everything's been about programs on reserve programs, like water, housing, education, even child welfare. But he's not mentioning what about our land rights. He hasn't talked about changing the land claims policy or the self-government policy, which basically municipalizes us.
Yes, that's another thing that the late Arthur Manuel told us on this program too, is that he was really interested to see when Canada said they would adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He was really wanting to see how Canada would handle that self-determination part. Are you seeing Canada's wish is to have a more assimilated Canada and for us to be living alongside each other where the balance of power is not with Indigenous peoples?
They're continuing what I call the termination plan. They're extinguishing Aboriginal title through modern treaties. They're trying to convert Indian bands into municipalities to their self-government policy. So they're using the Assembly of First Nations as the body to organize all of our chiefs into a meeting with the federal cabinet, including the Justice Minister, who's doing a working group on reviewing law and policy. But we have no say in that. The grassroots have no input. So this is something that we have to organize to challenge.
All right, we're going to go to a caller we have on the line from Edmonton. Brad, what do you want to say about Canada 150?
Well, nobody's even mentioning the United Nations is actually against the Aboriginals, against everybody in Canada. They're trying to take total control over our country, and not just Canada, but every other country in the world. Nobody's mentioning the United Nations Agenda 21/30. That's taking over our counties, taking over our provinces, taking over our country, telling us what we can and we can't do. I mean, the fact that the United Nations is even mentioned as something to use for status or to use for anything, they're diabolical. Their whole big plan is actually back to what's the word I'm looking for? Back to total annihilation, total destruction. Are the Aboriginals going to be first doing that? Probably, because they're going to get into. Actually, I dare say I went to a MNA, Métis Nation of Alberta, climate change workshop. I could not believe it. These people there, they're educated to think the way that they want them to think. As far as the United Nations Agenda 21 is, it actually has a front called SDIR, Sustainable Development and Industry Relations. That is totally United Nations agenda, totally New World Order propaganda. And none of these people, not one of them, and I mean, I'm 45 years old, one of the instructors there, she was 45 as well. They have no clue. They don't realize. They think that everything is based on whatever they were told. They can't think for themselves. And I mean, that's where we're going, and it seems I haven't heard anybody yet mention this.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. I do remember Kanahus about what good is the UN really, but it is a vehicle to get your word out there. We're going to go to another caller on the line. We have Johnny calling from Southern Ontario. Johnny, what do you have to say about Canada's 150th? Johnny.
Oh yeah, sorry. I just wanted to include there the law and the basis of Canada, how it's a fraud. The 1867 B&A Act only created a central legislature for a united colony whose only power was to advise the Governor-General as an agent of the Imperial Parliament. Before the Dominion of Canada can federate, it must be independent from such an empire to create a union. So so-called Canadians have been free to do so since the 1931 Statute of Westminster, but have not done so yet. The 1982 Constitution also was not ratified by the Canadian people, and the inclusion of the notwithstanding clause negates it as a constitution. So Canada, its provinces, laws, courts, treaties, and the Indian Act are void. where agents of the Crown representing themselves as Canada, including these INAC chief and councils, they're guilty of misprision of treason and fraud expressed as such by the constitutional law, which is the Royal Proclamation. So Canadians need to know who they are. Their country is a fraud if they look into their history. So I just wanted to include that in today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for your comment. You brought up some really big ideas that we have explored before, and I've heard researchers talk about, that you're right, that BNA Act, it only talked about the government, how their people would treat the Indigenous people, had nothing to do with Indigenous peoples. But anyway, we'll have to move on here, going on to another caller. Hart Purley, you are Maliseet, you're in Maliseet territory. Hart, what do you have to say about Canada's 150th? Hart Purley?
Hi there.
Hi, what do you have to say about Canada's 150th?
Well, it's really not going to be Canada's 150th. It's going to be the end of Canada. The United Nations is taking control over Canada. Unfortunately, we actually have an Aboriginal Prime Minister, but he doesn't seem to realize that he's Aboriginal or doesn't want to. And he's turning his back, obviously, on the Aboriginal people. And unfortunately, he's already signed paperwork to basically buddy-buddy with the United Nations and giving control of everything to the United Nations. So does that not, I dare say, pardon the pun, trump everything that we're talking about? All of a sudden, the United Nations is really calling the shots for the Aboriginals and everybody else in Canada.
Interesting thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us. Russ, what do you think about what our viewers are saying about the stance of the United Nations and Indigenous peoples?
Well, I think the United Nations is a vehicle, as you pointed out. Since the 1970s, Indigenous leaders have been going there, even before that, actually, to push for recognition of Indigenous peoples at the United Nations. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples represents at least 2 decades of work. And although it's not perfect, it is a minimum standard with which to judge how Canada and other countries are treating Indigenous people. Their domestic policies are inconsistent with the articles of the Declaration. So it is governed by state governments, and we have to remember that. But we need to go there and press our issues, because there's over 100 million Indigenous peoples around the world.
Yes, and definitely getting our voice in there. Just to tease our third segment here, Russ, how do you see a reorganization of Canada? What do you see? Definitely
there needs to be constitutional change, I think. The talks in the 1980s ended in failure to define Aboriginal treaty rights in Section 35. We now need to do that in light of the international standards set out by the UN Declaration. And that means we need to get organized to press the government to restructure Canada. The federal government has spending powers that they could use to help support First Nations to take on provincial governments, to press for their lands, territories, and resources, which the provinces have stolen. And that's what we need to push on. We need to push in for land right.
All right, keep that thought. Stay with us. There's still more Canada 150 to put in focus after the break. But once again, here is artist Kent Monkman on how he sees Canada's 150th impact on Indigenous peoples.
You can't really talk about the last 150 years unless you actually bring the residential schools into this conversation. So the impact has been, vast, and it's been multi-generational. Almost every Indigenous family has been affected by residential schools. So I felt like it was really almost central to the telling of this story that I wanted to tell. And you know, the TRC has really shed light on the breadth and the layers of damage, you know, in our communities. So, you know, I was reading part of the TRC, and it talked about how the Indian agent and the Métis or a nun or a priest would come, and so I wanted to create a visual image that really just kind of captured what that moment must have been like. I hope Canadians educate themselves more about Indigenous people, and to you know, to be open-minded, to learn more about, you know, the Indigenous populations that were here before them. To read the TRC, there's a starting point. There's information there now, and I feel like Canadians, there's their opportunity to learn, to educate, and to make some steps towards reconciliation, which has to come from Canadians, not from Indigenous people.
And that was artist Kent Monkman again, talking about learning that colonial past, you know, is a step forward to reconciliation. Kanahus, you know, listening to the discussion that's taken place so far, do you see, like, can there be this so-called reconciliation?
No, I believe in what Russ says, and reconciliation has to be our lands. That's what we're talking about, is land and liberation and our freedom, and we don't have that right now. We don't have the freedom to go out and be Secwepemc or be Native on the territory, or have the freedom to even stop a destructive project from destroying our water. I myself was locked up in jail here by Canada, and my baby was still nursing from me and 3 months old, and they still took my baby from me in order to throw me into prison, and that was for the Sun Peak Ski Resort and the resistance there. And I was also in jail in Standing Rock, you know, for standing up with our relatives there that are opposed to a pipeline destroying and contaminating the water. So that's what reconciliation looks like for Canada and the US government, is throw the natives in jail and just shut them up. But no, we're not going to shut up, and we're here, and we're going to be a strong voice, and the young people are coming up. They're a strong voice for our nation, and they are impatient, and they're not going to wait around for any policies to change. They're going to go out and get what they want, and that's freedom, and that's being able to be on our territory and our land.
Yeah, there are so many of our young people, like the Indigenous population. The young people are the fastest growing population in the country. What do you think is going to change the minds, like, you know, Kent Monkman referred to, for Canadians to learn a little bit more about the Indigenous perspective and maybe even change their minds a little?
The young people are very intelligent and very smart. They grew up in a colonized society. So when you use this buzzword decolonization in Indigenous territories, a lot of Native young people are already on that path of decolonization, learning our language, learning our medicines, picking our berries, going and getting their first kill out on the territory. These are very empowering, that change the whole life of Indigenous youth. And this is what we need to continue to promote, is to get our young people out onto our territory. That's where the fight is, that's where the relearning is, and that's where our connection to our land is out there. And once we get out there, they can't remove us all from our territory. It's time to leave the Indian reservation system and get out onto our territory and take back our land and occupy it.
All right, we're going to go to a caller on the line, and this really is Hart Pearly. I guess when I said we were talking to Hart Pearly, that wasn't actually Hart Pearly, but now I think we have Hart Pearly on the line, who is in Maliseet territory. Hart, is that you?
Yes, it's me.
Oh, good, great. What do you have to say about Canada's 150th?
Well, how we perceive Canada's 150th is 150 years of stolen land. And we have a very strong treaty over here in the east called the Peace and Friendship Treaty, and we live by that treaty. We recognize it as the mothers and grandmothers of the Maliseet Nation. We are living by that treaty, and we're forcing Canada and the provincial government of New Brunswick to look at that and to ensure that it's respected. and maintained as our ancestors had left it. Now, as for the 150th anniversary of stolen land, we will be taking action. And right at this moment, I can't say where that action will be taken, but this weekend on May 20th, we are moving up to an area called Sisson Brook, which is about 1 hour southeast of our community. And we are going back onto our homeland and showing Canada and the provincial government and any other government that our land is never have been ceded, surrendered, or sold. So we are moving there. We're building our community to show our nation that there is an alternative other than the Indian Act concentration camps.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Hart Purley calling from Maliseet territory. Russ, what do you think it's going to take? You know, there's been, Hart talked about the treaties. We do have the numbered treaties as we go west. Canada will say, well, you agreed to share the land. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think we have to remember that when the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Agreement was passed over Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, they were imposing not only the Indian Act, which had been amended in 1927 to prohibit Indians from hiring lawyers for defending their land rights, but also they were having passed laws prohibiting Indians from leaving the reserves without the permission of Indian agents in Saskatchewan and Alberta in particular. So that's when they passed the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, where they gave supposed control over the lands and resources to the provinces on the prairies. So I think, you know, the whole issue of sharing the land means the proper interpretation and implementation of treaties has to come about, and that isn't just Canada's interpretation. The Department of Justice, which Jody Wilson-Raybould heads up now, it also includes the treaty nations and the treaty peoples. So I think treaties 1 through 11 treaty peoples need to get out on the land and tell their treaty chiefs that they better start stepping up and getting Canada to respect the treaties and start taking actions like we're hearing in British Columbia, out in the east in New Brunswick, probably in Quebec and Ontario. All these places, Indigenous peoples need to start stepping up and exercising their rights of self-determination and rights to lands, territories, and resources on lands that the provinces are claiming, because it's the provinces that we have to challenge. And all the federal policies are designed to assist the provinces in eliminating our rights. As I mentioned, you know, extinguishment of title through comprehensive claims, turning us into municipal governments under provincial jurisdiction, under self-government policy. We need to challenge these things. Trudeau promised, you know, to implement the TRC recommendations, the UN articles, you know, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He needs to be pressed, and so does Jody Wilson-Raybould, that they need to get rid of these policies, and they have to respect and affirm our Aboriginal and treaty rights like the Constitution says, and also recognize free, prior, and informed consent like the UN Declaration says. Because we do have international human rights, which we need to start also relying on and going to the United Nations and demanding that there be international oversight about what Canada is doing to us. And in fact, we're planning an action in Geneva at the United Nations in August when Canada appears there before the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. There's a number of us from across Canada going there to work on a report to counter what Canada's saying about their treatment of Indigenous peoples. Because we know they're going to say, oh, it's a nation-to-nation process. We're working on reconciliation. And we've invested $11.8 billion in new money into programs, but those dollars are for on-reserve dependency programs and won't address the long-term needs of Indigenous peoples into the future for these younger generations that are coming up behind us. We need more land for that, and we need jurisdiction.
Just hold your thought there, Russ. We're quickly running out of time, but there are a whole bunch of social media comments that I want to get to very quickly. We asked on social media to share your thoughts by finishing this sentence. Canada is celebrating 150 years of... of making monies off land and resources without having a share, nor do they hire Indigenous peoples to work in different sectors. 50 years of treating First Nations people as second-class citizens, denial of treaties and what's right and honorable, unpaid rent, shame, confederation, colonization, misery, genocide, resource extraction, oppression, broken treaties, lies, cultural appropriation, colonial appropriation, and genocidal BS, false identity. There are just like so many responses that we got from that question. Kanahus, so what's the message that you want to leave our audience with today about Canada's 150th?
Well, I hope that Canadians or other people out there choose not to celebrate Canada Day, but instead get out onto the streets, get out onto their territory, and join with everybody in this Unsettling Canada 150. It's on Facebook. You could also check out Native Land 150, a countdown to the Canada Day celebrations, and hear what we have to say on a daily basis.
July 1st.
Oh, yeah, July 1st.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Kahanus Manuel, thank you so much for joining us in studio here today. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care.